There we go. Well, this morning, I'm sorry to tell you, but we're not actually studying the Word. We're studying about the Word. Yeah, that's close enough. I think it's going to be really encouraging. It'll be definitely informative, but hopefully also very encouraging to know that what you have in your hand is the Word of God. That there is no doubt that this is beyond what we have in our hands today is beyond human ability to produce, right? And so we'll take a look at that. But we're answering the question that people ask, why are our Bibles different? So we're looking at why our Bibles are different today, because as time has moved forward, there was a period in time, where everybody in the congregation had the same Bible. They all had the King James Version, and they all read it. And when the preacher read from his Bible, everybody read along, and they read the exact same words. And then, there's some congregations that really try to stick with that, where all of the pew Bibles and people are encouraged to get the same Bible, such as the New American Standard, right? That was a very popular Bible for a long time. And most people in many congregations use the New American Standard Bible. And so it was very consistent, right? But in our congregation, we probably have 6 different translations that are used. The one that's read from the pulpit is often different from the one that's on the screen. And so sometimes we have questions. And from a evangelistic standpoint, sometimes questions arise as well. We were studying with a young man in Indonesia, in Yogyakarta. Him and his friend had come over to our house. They were Muslims, and they were university students at the State Islamic University. And as we were looking through Acts, they must have been coached, because they point right to Acts chapter 8, verse 37, and say, why isn't this verse in this Bible, right? And so why isn't that verse in this Bible? And so that's one of those questions, right, that people have. And so when we're studying with somebody, just as a kind of a helpful thing, if you will use the same translation that they're using, then there'll be a lot less confusion in studying with somebody, right? So if you're sitting down with somebody and they're using the NIV, and you're like, man, the NIV? All right. So you take an NIV and study with them, right? And use the NIV with them, because that's the Bible they read. And so that'd just be helpful. Or convince them to get the right Bible. One of the two. All right. So why are our Bibles different? So I've got 6 main reasons why they're different. And one is the underlying Greek text of the translation, right? That's probably makes up the biggest difference, as in the biggest meaningful difference within a text is the underlying Greek text that the translators use to produce your English Bible. And then number 2 is the time of translation, right? That means what year was it translated in? That's going to make a very big difference in what you actually read on the page. And then translation philosophy, right? That's going to make a big difference as well. What's the philosophy that the people who are translating your Bible using? Because the philosophy of the translators that translate the ESV is very different than the philosophy of the translators that translated the Message, right? 2 very different philosophies in translation being used there. That's going to produce a different words on the page. Okay, and then target reading level. Right? If you're writing to a 12th grade reading level, well, that's going to produce different words on the page than a translation that's targeting a 5th grade reading level, right? So that's going to make a big difference. Copyright concerns, that's going to make a smaller difference, I think, but in today's world, when you come out with a new translation, you can't be exactly the same as another translation. Otherwise, that's going to be a copyright violation. Okay, and then theological biases is another possibility here that comes into making some differences in our Bibles. And so today, I really want us to mostly focus on the underlying Greek text that can cause some of the biggest differences in our Bible translations. And so, and then in our next class, we'll go through all of the rest of them, because they're all kind of tied together and interwoven. And so I think we can go through those a lot quicker. But for a Greek text, right, when we're looking at that, there's some terminology that would be good to have. this Greek text right here, this is called an uncial text, meaning it's all written in capital letters, right? So the earliest manuscripts and probably, so this is called a manuscript, right? And typically when we think of a manuscript, we're thinking like you're an author, you write your manuscript, you send it to the publisher, right? Well, the manuscript here, that would be, in textual criticism, that would be called the autograph, okay? So these are called manuscripts because they are handwritten versus printed on a printing press, okay? So a manuscript is handwritten. Whenever you read that in anything that you're studying, they say, well, the Greek manuscripts, they mean the handwritten copies of the original. And so the original one that Paul wrote or had written by one of his scribes would be called the autograph, okay? So that it's still a manuscript because it's handwritten, but it's the autograph, meaning it is the original handwritten letter, right, to say the Ephesians or something. And so the older ones, and probably the autograph, in other words, what Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, James wrote, looked like this. All capital letters, no spacing between words, and no punctuation, okay? And then as time went on and language evolves, they invented basically another script, which is called a minuscule script, meaning that it has uppercase and lowercase, and they put in the punctuation as well. And so this one right here took a lot longer to write because you got to lift the pen or the quill or whatever it is, the stylus you're using, for every stroke, basically, you lift it off the page. Whereas this one here, it's much more like cursive, where you don't have to lift it off the page for every single stroke that you write, okay? And so they believe that this was invented to speed copying, right? So you could copy letters faster. And so they came up with the minuscule, which is basically what our Greek New Testaments today are written in. Although they're printed, they're not handwritten, but they're written in that style, the minuscule style. Most of the manuscripts that we have copies of, like that they found in somebody's tomb or some ancient library somewhere, are minuscule. Yeah?
The one on the left.
Yep. This one here? Yep.
Is that in Greek original?
It is, yes. So so we're talking about Greek manuscripts. They're all written in Greek. There are other handwritten translations of the Bible into various languages, but those are like a subcategory because they're a translation. They're not just a copy of a original Greek manuscript or an original Greek letter, right? So those would be translations, and they would be in a different language. But yeah, so both of these are Greek, even though they look very different. If for us to read this right now, even if this was in English, right, would be fairly difficult because that's not the way that we're used to reading, right? We're not used to having to divide, to separate words or to put in the punctuation based on context. We're not used to that. They're used to this when they read this, and they could read it perfectly fine, right? If somebody who only knew this was handed this, they'd be like, what? I don't know this is really hard to make out, right? Because the letters are even shaped differently, you know? And so, anyway, so those are kind of some of these. So the oldest ones are like this. The newer ones are like this. The majority are like this. The minority are like this, okay? And so this one here was found in a monastery, and actually it was being thrown away when the guy found it in the 1800s. Well, he didn't find it. The monks had it that were there, but he went there, and they gave him part of it, and they were getting ready to burn it. And so, and then anyway, he went back later, and they gave him more. And so this one right here contains almost all of the Old Testament and almost all of the New Testament. This one right here is just Matthew. Just because I picked this one because it looks cool, right? It's a good example of the text. But anyway, this is in the British Museum. I think they're both in the British Museum now. And this is from the 4th century. And so as we're talking about 4th century, what years would that cover? Yeah, 300 to 399, right? This is from the 12th century, 1100 to 1199, right? Okay. So that's kind of what we have here. The Sinaiticus is from the 4th century, and it was found on Mount Sinai, apparently, or what they call Mount Sinai, when it was found in 1844. It's in the British Museum, but it rotates through some various other museums, like the Russian National Library and other places. Anyway, and then this other one was from the 12th century, and it was found in 1760. They're not sure. I guess they're not sure, but it's found from 1760 to 1770 in Athos. I don't know where Athos is, but it's also in the British Museum. So found in the late 1700s. All right. So that's kind of what we're talking about here, is we're talking about the Greek text that underlies our New Testament translations. And so with that, here's a chart right here. Now this is one thing that's really encouraging about the Greek manuscripts is, right, all of these are Greek authors, okay? And they all wrote, here's when they wrote, right? So 79 AD, 17 AD, up there 101 or 110 AD. And then here's the earliest manuscript that we have of their work, okay? Here's the New Testament. The earliest manuscript that we have that we know of, if we've dated it properly, is 125 AD, right? So very close to when the originals were written, right? If you take Revelation, written in maybe 95, right? So, I mean, that's not too far as history goes, especially when you compare it to all these other ones here, right? This is written in 50 BC, and the earliest manuscript we have is the 9th century AD, 800s, right? So 900 years or so, right? Something like that. I forgot which one I pointed to. But anyway, long time. All right, and then over here, the time gap, 30-year time gap, right? That's it. Some of these other ones, 400, 800, 150, 750-year time gap from when it was originally written to when the earliest manuscript that we have is, right? So the New Testament is by far the best, right? We have the best information, the closest information to the original. And then here are the number of manuscripts that we have, right? 36 up here with a 750-year gap. But this one, we have 5,856 copies, handwritten copies of the New Testament or parts of the New Testament, right? So when you look at that, the New Testament blows away all other ancient writing. And all of these other ones here, we just, like, you study these things in college if you take, this type of literature, right? I mean, you'll study all those people in college. And they're like, hailed it as authoritative, right? Like, this is authoritative text here. Well, why don't those scholars, those literary scholars, do the same thing with the New Testament when the evidence that we have for them is so much better than what we have for right, Iliad's Odyssey? Where is that? Oh, Homer's Iliad, right? 400 years apart. Yeah, I mean, we do have a lot of copies of that, 1,900 copies, right? I mean, that's a lot of copies.
People still read it.
Yeah.
It's still printed.
Right. And so here we've got the New Testament. Okay, so this right here, I think, should be something that really encourages us to say, wow, right? I mean, the scholarly world, academia, says that all these other ones are good, right? Well, what you've got in your hand is way better than anything else that they say is good, right? So that should be encouraging, yeah.
What would the language be?
What's that?
Written in Koine?
Yeah, well, some of these would be in classical Greek, right, not Koine.
Yeah, a little later.
Yeah, and so for Greek, right, you have at least 3 different time periods where you have differences in language, right? You have classical Greek, and then you have what's called Koine Greek, which is what the New Testament is written in, and then you have modern Greek. And so, and there's a difference between them, right? There's a lot of similarities, but there's also differences as well. And so it's kind of like Old English to Middle English to like Elizabethan English, then to modern English, right? I mean, there's some similarities, but there's also a lot of differences in English in those time periods. And so Greek has the same thing. But our New Testaments are written in what's called Koine Greek or Common Greek.
I was just, if I may.
Yeah.
So that phasing out of Koine into
Yeah.
modern Greek,
Mm-hmm. Well,
Because we say that, we can trust what we read because it was Koine and it doesn't change.
right.
It was
So
500,
yeah.
800.
So you have when okay. So what happened like in history, right? When you had what's called the Great Schism within the Catholic Church, right? You had the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople, and each of them was vying for power as the universal bishop of the church. And they couldn't come to agreement, and so the church split, and you have the Western Church and you have the Eastern Church, right? So the Western Church became the Roman Catholic Church, and they transitioned to Latin rather than using the Greek text, okay? And then, but the Eastern side with Constantinople became the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Syrian Orthodox, all of the Eastern churches became what are referred to as Orthodox. And they continued to use the Greek, right? But what happened when Islam began to spread and they took over the whole Byzantine Empire, which was modern-day Turkey, where Constantinople is, and at that time then the Greek language really started to go down. So that would have been, I don't know, 700s, 800s maybe, somewhere around there. And then it didn't go away, but it started to go down. And then as it began to grow in popularity, the modern Greek began to evolve from there. So, but what really kind of stopped it, as far as manuscripts go, is the printing press, right? Once you got the printing press, then you got copies of tons of copies that are all exactly the same, and so so right now as far as textual criticism, which is what the science is called, is only dealing with the handwritten copies. Okay. Yeah.
You might have answered it, I know. I recently heard a discussion I was watching, I think on YouTube or something, between a Muslim and a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And the question, and I didn't think it was answered well enough in the video, I still don't know. Why was the Bible written in Greek when the language of the time and the area was Aramaic?
Well, I think that
Because the
Yeah.
Quran is written in Arabic,
Arabic, yeah. Mm-hmm.
the language of that area and that time.
Right.
And that was the argument being made by the Muslims.
Yeah. So, okay. So you have what Alexander the Great, right? When he conquered all the way over towards India, his goal was not only to take land, but it was to spread Greek culture and Greek language, and he was very efficient at that. And so, if you were in Palestine and you were to communicate with somebody who was not a Jew, right? You would communicate in Greek, right? That's just the language that you would speak. It's kind of like today with English, right? If you're a business person and you go to Singapore and you've got somebody there from China, you're going to speak in that business meeting in English, right? It used to be French, but now it's English. And so, or you go to Russia and you could be in Russia at a business meeting with somebody from Turkey, somebody from Egypt, somebody from Japan, somebody from China, somebody from France, and somebody from Germany, and you're there. That business meeting is going to be conducted in English, right? Because that's the language that's spoken by the vast majority of people. And so I think that is why that the New Testament was written in Greek, is so that it would cover the widest audience, right? And so anyway, that's what I think.
And weren't there some books also written in Hebrew?
In what?
In the Hebrew language?
Well, all the Old Testament was. I mean, the vast majority of the Old Testament was. Some of the Old Testament is written in Aramaic, but most of it's written in Hebrew. Yeah, yeah.
All of today's pilots
Mm-hmm.
have to do everything in English.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
Yep, exactly. Most of your master's programs or your doctoral programs around the world are going to be done in English, even if it's in Germany or something. And so things like that. Yeah. So let's see. Okay, so, and most of the manuscripts, right, they come from outside of Israel, most of them that we have. And you think about that, that would tend to make sense, because how many letters were written to people in Israel? Maybe, yeah, Hebrews. Maybe James. Besides that, they're all written to other people. Maybe Matthew, right? Probably Matthew. but all the rest are written to people outside of Israel. And so it would seem to make sense that they would come from outside of Israel. There's another reason why, is because they're written to locations outside of Israel where Hebrew or Aramaic would have been spoken. But there's another interesting thing when we get onto the variations in the text that the Muslims did, which is pretty interesting. They basically destroyed all variants. All right, so let's see here. Let's just kind of, let's think about what happened here. Okay, now this is hypothetical, right? But it's to help us kind of think through the process of what took place. So let's say Paul, he wrote a letter to the Ephesians. Okay, so on the map there, that's letter 0, right? That's the original. Letter 0 is the original letter to the Ephesians that Paul wrote. Now it would be the same for Romans and Philippians and all those ones. There's one original out there, right? One copy. Well, what? No, there's not even a copy. It is the original.
Well, I mean, it's not a copy, you're right. It's, one issue.
Yeah, the autograph.
There's only one.
Yep, one autograph. Okay, and yeah, the OG. And so he writes it there, and then people there, they have the letter, so they copy the letter, right? And then they take that letter back to where they live. And so on this map, then we see that somebody came to Ephesus and they copied it and they took it to Italy. Somebody copied it and they took it to Greece, and somebody copied it and took it to Crete. Somebody took it to Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Galatia, right? And so that's the first generation copy because they copied Paul's original letter. Now, have you ever played the phone game? Okay. Why is the phone game fun to play? Lacey's looking at me like, well, I don't know what you're talking about, the phone game.
It's funny how it changes when you say, like you may say, the dog went to the bedroom or something like that, and by the time it gets to the very end of passing that message on to the other people, it's something completely different.
Completely different, right? Yeah, and it's hilarious, right? Because then the original person gets to say what the original was, and everybody laughs because it's so different, right? Like if we did it here and we went through everybody, by the time it got to Michelle, she would say something probably very different from what Quentin said.
That's why gossiping can be so.
Oh yeah, right? So now, what would we expect in a situation like this? Right, so we're zooming in here. Here's the original, right? The original got taken to Galatia, right? And then it got copied by a bunch of people, and they took it different places. And so we're just going to follow 2A, right? Because now we are in the second generation of copies, and each of those has copies made of them, okay? So we're just going to follow the line of 2A. So 2A gets copied. Now we're at the third generation, the fourth generation, and then it gets copied a couple times. So we come down here to this one, and it gets copied and copied and copied and copied. So this is the 8th generation away from the original letter, right? This person has never seen the original letter. He copied this one, and this person never saw the original. He copied this one. What do you think the comparison between this one and this one would be? Knowing what we know about the phone game.
It would be terrible if it was a phone game.
Right? It would be so different from the original, right? That's what we would expect to find, right? Because we understand how people function, right? How we work and how we copy and how we get sloppy and how we change things because we have biases. You know, we're like, well, I don't know. I think the guy that copied this before messed this up, so I'm going to fix it, right? And then the next guy comes along and he's like, well, I don't know. I think he messed this up. I'm going to fix it to this. And right, and then it changes and changes. But what actually happens in real life, this copy is strikingly similar to this copy. Amazingly similar, right? Amazingly similar to the point that you would say that is beyond human ability. And when you multiply that over 5,000 plus copies that come from all of these different regions, right? So you have copies in Egypt, right? So this guy took it to Egypt and then probably the hundreds of copies or thousands of copies that are made here, they never saw the original. And they never saw this guy's copy, and they never saw that guy's copy, and they never saw that guy's copy, or the generations that came after that, right? So each one of these would be called a text family, right? That's a text family. It started from some copy, and then copies were made of that, and it created one family of text type, okay? And so the two main text types that we have are what are called a Byzantine text type, which are texts from Greece over, right, to about here. This whole area, that's the Byzantine text type. It comes from that region. And then you have the Alexandrian text type, which comes from Egypt. And so those are the two main text types that we have. The Western text type we also have, but there's less of them, because the Western text type would have gone to Italy, and then when the church split, they switched to Latin, so they translated everything into Latin, and so we don't have as many Greek manuscripts from the Western church. Okay, so when you take, a distant generation copy from an Alexandrian, and you take a distant generation copy from Galatia, there's some differences. But they are so similar that it is amazing, right? Amazing how similar they are. And so how does that happen? Yeah, you think maybe that there's a providential protection of God's word so that we have what he wants us to have, that somehow he did not allow either the major mistakes to be preserved, right? In other words, they got destroyed, whatever happened to them. Over time, you think about this, you're talking handwritten copies. I mean, how long do you typically keep a Bible? Do most people even keep the same Bible their entire life? Many do, but a lot. I mean, if you used it a lot, you'd wear it out. Then you have to go get a new one, right? Yeah, like you, especially you. And so this same thing happens with these handwritten copies. People used them, they got ruined, they made another copy, right? And so one of the reasons that we have the oldest manuscripts come from Egypt is because of the climate. All right, so the climate there is dry and hot and allows for documents to be preserved for a longer period of time. Some of them were found in tombs, some of them were found in ruins, like an old library ruin or something like that. They dig through there, they find all of these artifacts and all of these documents, and some of them are copies of the New Testament, right? And so, striking similarity between all of these. So let's see. So here's the differences right here, the main differences. In the variations, these are called variants, right? These are text variants. And so number one, right, which is the biggest portion, are spelling errors, okay, in copying. That seems to make sense, right? Spelling error. But is a spelling error, does it make any difference in the meaning of a word? No, I mean, it's potentially, if you spelt it wrong and you spelt a different word, right, that could make a difference. But if you spell cat, K-A-T or C-A-T, does it make a difference? It's still a cat, right? A cat's a cat, all right? And then non-meaningful variance is number 2, right, which is the second largest one, meaning that we're going to look at 2 of these as examples in a second here, meaning that the difference in the 2 makes no difference to the meaning, okay, which is typically word order, okay? We'll talk about that in a second. And then not viable is number 3, and not viable is more of a subjective. It's more subjective than the other 2, and so is 4. So 3 and 4 are more subjective. Not viable means that the scholars are reading this copy, right? They have this copy that they found in some tomb somewhere, and they're like, there's no way that John would have said this, right? He used the word computer here. This is totally ludicrous, but just saying, right? He used the word computer here, and computers weren't written by then. There's no way he wrote that, or computers weren't invented by then. There's no way he used that. Or it's a word that is nowhere used in the entire New Testament, but this copy has it, and only this copy has it, right? No other copy has it. So like, chances are that's not original. That's not viable, in other words, as being authentic. So they'll scratch that one. Okay, and then, yeah.
Is that where, like in some of these, they'll say it omits it?
We'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that. And then the next one is both meaningful and viable. Now that's the one where we see differences, right? These ones up here, we don't see any difference in our English translation from any of these, right? Because they're not meaningful. And so they don't make it into an English translation. This one makes it into English translations, okay? And so we'll look at that in a minute here, which is exactly what Joseph just asked about. So let's go back to the spelling errors, right? Here's an example of a spelling error. In the Koine Greek language has what's called a movable nu, right? Nu is basically the letter N in English, okay? So the Greek letter nu or N can be put at the end of a word that comes before a word starting with a vowel. Do we have something like that in English? Yeah, with the word a, right? A and an, okay? And so similar to using a or an in English. So here's an example, right? An author versus a author. That's a spelling error, right? I mean, you'd get marked down if you were in 5th grade and you did that. But does it change the meaning of the word? No. I mean, I have spelling errors up here all the time, don't I? Does it change the meaning of what I'm trying to say? No, right? It's just a spelling error by somebody who copied it down, right? You misspell Christ.
It depends on the word.
Well, it would. It would.
It's like on social media, the word I see misspelled the most, I think, is the word to.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
everything
Yep.
is T-O
Yep.
when they really meant T-O-O or T-W-O.
Yep.
So you have to translate
That's right.
that.
Yeah, that's good.
I think that's why it depends on the word.
Yeah, right. It would. Now that would make a difference. However, let me ask you this: have you ever misunderstood the meaning of it when because they didn't put enough O's there? Does that ever? There could be a possibility when we are like, oh, I totally misunderstood what you meant because you didn't put the W in there when you said 2 cats went to the park, right? But we understand, oh, they misspelt it, it means TWO, right? It doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, although if you took that word in isolation, it did make a change, right? And so, yeah, but that's a really good point. It can make a difference. So anyway, here's just an example, right? Misspelled words is the largest part of it. And you think about this too, over time, words change spelling sometimes, right? And different regions have different spellings. Like, do you spell author the same in British English as you do in American English? I know you spell color different. Is it the same? Okay. Well, I didn't know, but just because it had the OR at the end, so. Yeah, right. In British English, it's OUR, but in American English, it's just OR at the end of color, right? And there's a lot of words like that that are spelled slightly differently. And so you might say, well, maybe in this region of the Roman Empire, they spell this particular word slightly differently than they spell it down in Egypt, right? That could be totally plausible, right? And so that could account for some of these differences. It doesn't change the meaning of the word or the meaning of the sentence or the paragraph. It just happens to be spelt differently. So, yeah.
Would this include maybe like punctuation errors?
Yes, yeah, it would include punctuation, but in the oldest ones, they didn't have any punctuation anyway. So, here nor there, really, on the punctuation. That was added. So the autograph, right? The autograph was the original copy, the original written part that Paul wrote. That's called the autograph. And almost certainly, it did not have any punctuation. Yeah. Yeah.
I saw a thing the importance of a comma.
Yeah, in English, right?
Grandma, and then let's eat grandma.
Yeah, that's right. Very true, right? And there's some places, I can't remember off the top of my head, but some translations, I should try to figure this out, or somebody else try to figure it out for the next time. Commas make a difference in English, for sure. But that is an interpretation, not a translation problem. Yeah.
So Koine Greek still around? I mean, do they still publish Bibles with that?
Oh yeah, we're going to see them here in a second. Yeah, you can still buy them. You can buy them, but it's not used, right? And so modern Greek, some differences between Koine and modern Greek that would make a difference in studying the Bible would be, pronunciation is different, right? So that's going to make a difference. And the way that Bible schools and seminaries teach students how to pronounce Koine Greek is different than modern Greek. So that'll be a difference. But there's also some syntax differences. Word order is more important in modern Greek than it is in Koine Greek, and we'll see that in a second here. Well, let's just look at it now. So many variants are due to word order in English. It would change the meaning of a sentence a great deal if you rearrange the words. For instance, John ate the bear ate John, right? Those are two totally different sentences, two totally different meanings. But in Greek, right, there is added to the word, I just put it in English here, it says subject, right? It's like John's subject. But in Greek, the way the word is written, a suffix is added to it to tell you whether that word is an object or it's the subject, right? And so John's subject ate verb, the bear object. Now let's read it here. The bear object ate verb, John's subject. It's the exact same thing. Word order doesn't matter in Greek like it matters in English, right? And so this sentence right here says the exact same thing as this sentence. But in English, they're very different, right? So you're copying it, and you read the sentence, you read it, okay, and then you go to write it. In our mind, we have to read it, understand it, and copy it in the same word order. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. In their mind, they could read it, understand it in a different word order, and write it in a different word order, and it means the exact same thing, right? And so that's another difference, right, where you get the subject and object replaced, because in Greek it doesn't really matter where it goes. One way that they do use it is for emphasis, right? Like if you have a list of names or something, typically the name that's put in the front of the list is the most important name, right? That's typical. Or if you want to put the object in the front because you want to emphasize the object, right? We would probably make that more of a passive sentence or something to emphasize the object. But you could put the object in the beginning of the sentence to emphasize that, and the subject later on down the road somewhere, right? So you could do that for emphasis, but as far as the understanding of the sentence, doesn't really make a difference. Yeah.
What I noticed in other languages besides English is they put the subject in a different place than we do.
Yeah.
That's very common in
Yep.
whether it's Spanish or German or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's hard for us to learn
Yeah.
a foreign language and vice versa.
Right. Yep. Yeah, like what is it called when you, the adjective, right? Like the White House or the house white, right? That kind of thing. Yep. Yeah. All right. So then we get to the meaningful and viable, right? 1%. 1% of all of the variants within all of the Greek all of the Greek copies, 1% of them is meaningful and viable, right? Which is 1,500 words out of 138,000, roughly 1%, right? But it doesn't actually make any difference. There's no variant reading that makes a difference to any doctrine that we believe, right? Any doctrine in the Bible. There's no significant difference, in other words, that makes any difference to what we believe. If a verse is not included in one, but it's included in another, say, and so we're like, man, this one verse that's included was obviously added, right, by some scribe at some point in time, because, say, almost no other copies have it, right? All over from Rome to Egypt to Galatia, none of them have it except for this one copy. This was probably added, right? But it'll say the same thing or something very similar to it, or the same doctrine will be taught in another passage, right? So if we don't have that verse, it doesn't actually change anything that we believe. Okay, does that make sense? Let's look at some examples. All right, so the underlying, oh man, we got a few minutes. All right, the underlying Greek text, we have three. One is called the Textus Receptus. The other is called the critical text, and it's abbreviated UN. We'll look at that in a second. And the other is the majority text. So three main Greek texts that are used to translate English Bibles, okay? The Textus Receptus, here you go, Tom. If you want to buy it, you can. It's right here, $10.59 on christianbook.com. It was created by a guy named Erasmus. He lived in the 1400s, and he used 6 to 7 manuscripts, right, meaning handwritten copies from the 12th to the 15th century to compile what is called the Textus Receptus, or the received text, okay? And so it was influenced heavily by his own subjective judgment on which variants should be included and which shouldn't be. He's the guy, right? Like, whatever he said goes, and that's what went in his Greek text, okay? The Textus Receptus. It was influenced by the belief that in the providential preservation of the biblical text, which is kind of what we talked about earlier, right? And the authority of the church. So if the church says this is the text, right? Kind of thing. And so from the Textus Receptus, right, we have the King James Version and the New King James in English, right? Our modern Bibles. The King James was translated from this text, and the New King James is also translated from this text, all right? And then we have what's called the critical text, and it is based on 5,000 plus manuscripts. So we went from 6 to 7 manuscripts to 5,000 plus manuscripts, right, is what this is based off of. But the compilation philosophy, right, is based on oldest is best, right? So they prioritize the older manuscripts, which are typically an Egyptian style text, not Egyptian language, but they come from Egypt, and they're copies that are very closely related to the copies that came from Egypt, because those are the oldest ones we have. Then utilizes a critical approach, and in my opinion, it's often subjective, because they'll say this is the best manuscript. Well, best is very subjective, in my opinion, right? Like, they'll say it's the best because it's the oldest, right? Let's just say it's from 400, okay? That's from 400 AD, and it's a copy of Revelation. And John wrote Revelation in 95 AD, so it's really close. But then you have a Byzantine text type from, say, 1200, right? And it's a copy of Revelation. And then they'll say, well, that's not as good because it's from 1200. Okay. But the Byzantine text type came from Turkey, where Revelation was written to, right? So you have proximity to where the original was is a plus, I think. And then you have, so now we don't know how many generations we are from each one. Let's say the Greek one, or I mean the oldest one, right, is a 10th generation copy, right? But it's really old, but it's a 10th generation copy. Maybe you have this one that's from the Byzantine text type, right, from the 1200s, but it's only an 8th generation copy, right? It was just longer periods of time between each copy. So how is it that the older one is necessarily better when you don't know what generation copy it was? And the newer one, how do you know that it's not as good? Because you don't know what generation copy it was, right? And so there's some subjectivity, I think, in the critical approach to this. So then it's based on seeking the earliest and most reliable textual witnesses. Again, most reliable, right? It's kind of like loaded language. Oh, this is the most reliable. Well, because I'm the scholar and I say it's most reliable, right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? But that's what they think it is. And so then this is the Greek text. You could buy it right now for $70. It's based on the New American Standard, the ESV, the NIV, all of our modern translations, except for one, are based on this text. Okay? And then we have the third one, which is called the majority text, and it's based off of the same 5,000 plus manuscripts as the critical text, but they follow the majority rules approach. Okay? The majority text is just what it says. We look at every single document that's out there, and we find out what the majority of them say. Right? Whatever the majority is, that's what goes in the Greek text. So you have some outliers, right? The outliers don't get in because they're not in the majority, right? So that's kind of how they figure this out. The critics of this will say, well, the majority of the text are a Byzantine text type, right? And they're much newer than all of the older ones. So it's weighted heavily towards the newer, minuscule text type from the Byzantine Empire, okay? And so that's be their criticism of that. But in the majority text, there's very little subjectivity to it. It's just the data. What's the data say? How many copies do we have? Okay, good. How many of them say this? The vast majority of them say this. Okay, that goes in the text. Only a few say this. Nope, that doesn't get in there, right? And it's just the data. So in that sense, it's maybe better, right, of an approach. But then they don't weight the old ones. They're like, I know it's really old and it might be close to the original, but it's not the majority of them, so it doesn't get in there. You see what I'm saying? So there's pros and cons to each of these approaches. Although remember, the differences are, we're talking 1% of all of the words in the Bible, right? And so we're kind of making a mountain out of a molehill here when people are arguing about which text should we use, right? Because you're talking very small, and it makes no meaningful difference to any doctrine that we teach, okay? And so then also it reflects the belief in the providential preservation of the majority text. And so majority text people say, this is the mechanism in which God used to preserve his text for us today. He preserved the majority of them. We can collect them. We don't have to be subjective. We can't allow theological bias. We can't allow any kind of, age bias or any type of bias. Just collect them and see what the majority says, and that's it, right? So that's kind of their approach. Come on in, folks. Sit down right there or there. Sorry, I'm going a little late. I apologize. But we're almost done. This is the last slide. Then we have the majority. We already talked about the majority. Oh, yeah. So the World English Bible, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is the only Bible that translates from the majority text. Okay? And so next week we'll talk about yeah, we don't have time. Yeah.
So did the Dead Sea Scrolls throw a wrench into any of this as far as the majority and all that?
No. So as far as the majority goes, right? Like, it's not any text that is found is going to have a very small chance of changing the Greek majority text, right? Say you find some copy, a stash of copies. You find 10 copies in some cave somewhere, and you bring them in. The majority text people say, cool, let's add it to the data, right? They put it in there, and does it make a difference or not? Nope, didn't make a difference. This is still the Greek text, right? But the critical text people, they're going to be sweating, and they're going to be like, oh, and they're going to have to analyze every single thing, and be like, well, what do you think here? Do you think John really meant this, or do you think he meant that? Or do you think that this was a scribe that did this because he didn't like John, so he changed this word? You know what I mean? Like, oh, this was a heretic here, so because this was a heretic, he changed this here in this text, and so that's why we can't accept it, because we think that the person who wrote this was a heretic. You know what I'm saying? And so there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into that. So I have 3 more slides. We could go over quickly if you want, or we could save it till next time. All right. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the day that you've given us to come together and to discuss your word and the reliability of your word. Lord, it is amazing how you have preserved it throughout history in such a way that is truly beyond human ability. We know the weaknesses that we have. We play the games and we laugh at them because we mess things up so many times when we try to copy it or relay a message. But over thousands of years, your word has been preserved by handwritten copies throughout a vast geographical region. Thank you, Lord, for the confidence that we can have in it. Lord, we thank you for your Son and how he is shared in your word. And we pray, Lord, that we will take this confidence that we have in it and in him, and we will use it to spread the gospel throughout